We all know the SEC has been a football powerhouse conference for quite some time now, and it's been that way pretty much from the beginning. Since 1932, which was the first year of the SEC, they claimed 39 football national championships, and there are still 15 that they could claim that they just don't. Since the start of the 2000s, they've just gotten even better, with 14 of the last 25 national titles and 6 of the last 10 college football playoff titles going to the SEC. When it comes to putting teams in the title game, nobody does it better than the SEC, or at least nobody has done it better than the SEC at this point. It's also bled into other things besides just national title games though, as the Heisman Trophy has also gone to 15 players who have been in the SEC, and if you count players who play at schools that are now in the SEC, they claim 27 of them. They now have also some of the best coaches, with guys like Nick Saban, Bear Bryant, and even Urban Meyer, as they won multiple national titles and coached in the conference. When you start winning as a conference, it's easy to keep winning, and in the arms race to compete in a conference like this, teams like Mississippi State and Missouri have even had their special years where they become playoff or title contenders. Mizzou back in 2013 and in 2023, and then Mississippi State back in 2014. But the SEC was never known for basketball. That was sort of the conference that everybody didn't really talk about, as outside of Kentucky, Florida, and Arkansas, the conference had not exactly been thriving at the sport. But about a decade or so ago, the SEC decided to pour a ton of money into hoops. All of a sudden, struggling programs were hiring big-time coaches and pouring money into basketball, and now all of a sudden, it's become historic. The SEC sent 14 teams to the 2025 NCAA tournament, and now has the record for most teams from a conference in the Sweet 16 at once. It has been a historic year for the Southeastern Conference, and while some people claim they're just as overrated in basketball as they are in football, what they've done is truly incredible. In today's video, I want to talk about the rise of SEC hoops, talk about how the conference got this reputation, and then talk about this season. We're going to go through all the schools that made the tournament, talk about how they got here, and just how far the SEC could go with the remainder of March Madness. But before we get started, if you're a big fan of college football, be sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like if you want to support today's video, and let me know what player, team, topic, or situation I can cover next. Now let's get started and talk about the rise of SEC hoops. As I said, the SEC didn't exactly have a bad reputation at basketball, as they had schools like Kentucky and Florida, but we've really seen their rise in the last couple of years, with schools like Auburn and Alabama taking the next step, Tennessee becoming really good, and then a plethora of big-time coaching hires. It's a very simple explanation though for why the SEC has suddenly gotten better. It's because if you're part of a more successful football conference, you have more money in your athletic department, and when they make more money, you can spend it on other things more than just football. Alabama is a prime example. Before Nick Saban, the Crimson Tide had 19 tournament appearances overall, with just 12 round of 32s and 8 Sweet 16s. After Saban was hired in 2007, the team devolved into getting worse due to the money being spent on football, but after years of success, money started to be redirected into the basketball program, and Alabama made their first Final Four ever last season. Okay, so now let's talk about each of the SEC teams that had a bid this year. So technically, we're going to go ahead and start with the Texas Longhorns, as they didn't make the field of 64, but they qualified for March Madness, playing in that first 4 matchup. Texas was definitely a controversial team to make the tourney, as in total, they went 19-15. They finished at 13th in the SEC, and were led by a couple of big players, including sensation Trey Johnson, and then guys like Tremont Mark, Arthur Kaluma, and Jordan Pope. Texas got a decent amount of wins, and I guess had good metrics, but they ended up losing 86-80 in the first round against Xavier, which was a thriller. After the season was over, they decided to fire their head coach, and it looks like they're moving forward with Sean Miller from Xavier as their next head guy. Okay, so the first school we're to talk about is Auburn. They are the number 1 overall seed in this year's bracket, as they finished the year at 28-5 and went 15-3 in the conference. They're led by head coach Bruce Pearl and their star power forward Johnny Broome. He averaged nearly 19 points per game and led the team in scoring, rebounds, assists, and blocks, and some thought he could have been the player of the year. They had some pretty big wins this year, including against another 1 seed in Houston, a win over Iowa State, and a 9-point win over Alabama. Auburn has ended up making a run so far in the tournament, as they beat Alabama State, number 9 seed Creighton, and then they'll face off with Michigan this upcoming week. The next 1 seed was the Florida Gators. They obviously had a big year, and despite a weird start to the season with their coach Todd Golden, they ended up putting that behind them as they went 30-4 on the year and finished second behind Auburn. They also had some pretty big wins on their schedule, like a 30-point win over number 1 Tennessee, 2 wins over Bama, and a 14-point win over Mizzou. They are led by their star guard, Walter Clayton Jr., who averaged nearly 17.5 points per game. You also had Elijah Martin and Will Richard, who each averaged about 14 points per game. With Todd Golden being a new coach, no one really knew how he would do in the tournament, but so far he led them to wins over number 16 Norfolk State and 8 seed UConn, which was a close game and a thriller. Going back down to the bottom of the bracket, let's talk about Vanderbilt. They are not known for their basketball program, and they play in a weird court, and last made the tournament in 2017. They've also only made one ever Elite 8 appearance, and that was back in 1965. That being said, they went 12-2 this season under their new head coach, and they went back to the tournament. Every team they lost to this season is already in the tournament, and they ended up beating number 6 Tennessee by 1 point, and they were led by guard Jason Edwards, who averaged nearly 17 points per game, making him one of the top scorers in the conference. It's hard to tell how good Vanderbilt will be in the future, especially after they lost in the first round to 7-seeded St. Mary's, after 2 attempts failed at tying the game in the last couple of seconds. Sneaking right ahead of Vanderbilt in the bracket was the Arkansas Razorbacks. They are a proud basketball program that has had some good teams recently, but they were not able to get over the hump and reach the Final Four, which they have not done since 1995. That might change though after they poached John Calipari from Kentucky, as he had the Hogs sitting at 20-13 in their first year, including overcoming an 0-5 start to conference play. Their big wins came against Kentucky and Missouri. The big wins came against Kentucky, Missouri, and Michigan, but they lost to pretty much everybody else who they were supposed to. They ended up getting a 10 seed in this year's tournament, and in typical John Calipari fashion, he has them advancing. They beat the 7-seeded Kansas by a couple of points in the first round, which was huge, and then they went and beat St. John's 75-66. They are a 2 seed, and Arkansas finds themselves in the Sweet 16 with a matchup against Texas Tech. They could make the Final Four this year, but I still think that's probably unlikely for now. Heading back up to the top of the bracket, we have the 2-seeded Tennessee Volunteers. They went 27-7 and finished 4th in the conference, but it was still good enough to make the championship game and get a 2 seed in the bracket. They're led by their 2-star guards in Chaz Lanier with 17.5 points per game and Zakai Ziegler with about 14. While they did lose some big games this year, like a 2-point loss to Auburn and a loss to Kentucky, they also had wins against Baylor, Mizzou, and Texas A&M. They're one of the top seeds in the tournament, and many are wondering if the Volunteers can finally get back to the Final Four. So far, it's looking so good, as they beat Wofford in the first round, took care of 7-seeded UCLA in the second round, and will now be headed to play against Kentucky in the Sweet 16. Speaking of Alabama, they have had a major rise in the last couple of years under head coach Nate Oates. They got a 2 seed in this year's bracket, and it was honestly somewhat of a disappointment for them actually. They had a great year last year, which ended in a Final Four, and they improved from 25-12 to 25-8. They ended up losing early in the SEC tournament, and lost 5 of their last 9, but still managed to get a 2 seed. Nate Oates is a super good coach, and Mark Sears is their best player, who averages nearly 19 points a game. Alabama had a lot of hype going into this year's tournament, and they struggled with 15-seeded Robert Morris in the first round, and then blew out St. Mary's in the second round. They will now face BYU, and will hope to get back to the Elite 8. Historically, Georgia is not a great basketball program. Outside of Anthony Edwards and Nick Claxton over the last couple of years, they have not had many big names, and they don't really do much in basketball. They ended up being good enough though, as they got a 10 seed in this year's tournament after going 8-10 in the conference and 20-13 overall. They beat St. John's, Kentucky, and Florida, and most of their losses came against ranked teams. They're another program under the rise under head coach Mike White, who was formerly at Florida, and in their first tournament in 10 years, Georgia was not able to move past the first round. In fact, I think they forgot they even played. Against the 8 seed Gonzaga, Georgia got killed 89-68, and it might have been the worst game in the first round. One of the more controversial additions to this year's tournament field was the Oklahoma Sooners. Coming over from the Big 12, Oklahoma didn't do so well in the SEC this year, going 6-12 in the conference, but with a 20-13 overall record under Porter Moser, it was okay. The SEC was so dominant that they ended up getting a 9 seed. Many did not expect them to go far and didn't think they should have been seeded that high, and they actually had a fall off. They started the year at 13-0, but ended up having a ton of losing streaks. But they had some good wins and some good players, as Jeremiah Fears is likely to be a lottery pick, and Jalen Moore is also really solid, but in the first round, Oklahoma was not able to overcome UConn. The game was close until the final minute, and then the Huskies pulled away. Kentucky is the program in college basketball in the SEC, and the last couple of years have not been super kind to them. They finally moved on from Coach Calipari after a ton of early exits, and former alum Mark Pope took over as the coach from BYU and kept the momentum going. The Cats got a 3 seed after going 22-11, and they would finish 6th in the SEC. They were led by guard Otega Owe with 16.5 points, and Jackson Robinson also had 13 points per game. They had an up and down year with wins against teams like Duke, Gonzaga, and Florida, but losses to teams like Ohio State, Texas, and Georgia. They ended up having quite the interesting year, and in the first round they destroyed Troy, who was the 14th seed, and then went ahead and beat Illinois by 9 points, who was the 6th seed. As I said, they'll face off with SEC foe Tennessee, and in the 3 versus 2 matchup, this could be one of the best games of the Sweet 16, and this would be huge for Mark Pope. Another team that's had a solid rise over the last couple of years is the Texas A&M Aggies. Sure, they had some good teams in the mid-2010s, but they're not known for being a basketball power. This season, the Aggies finished at 22-10 and 5th in the SEC, and this got them a 4 seed. Buzz Williams came over from Virginia Tech and has done a tremendous job for them. They had a weird year, as they lost their first game against UCF and also lost to Oregon, but they also had plenty of good wins. They beat number 1 Auburn, Creighton, Purdue, and even Ole Miss, and their top scorer Wade Taylor averaged nearly 16 points per game, but was not able to lead Texas A&M past the round of 32. After defeating number 13 seeded Yale in the first round, they would lose to Michigan after the Wolverines pulled away late, and now the Aggies are at home. Sometimes I honestly feel bad for Mississippi State. It feels like they're always behind and never get the credit they deserve, as they've had a couple of good years in football, and recently Chris Jans has helped them get back in basketball. Tolu Smith was excellent for them for a couple of seasons, and this year they ended up going 21-12 and finished at 9th in the SEC. They started the year as an unknown until they knocked off Pittsburgh by over 30 points and have wins over teams like Memphis, McNeese, and A&M. They also have plenty of losses though, and as for players, they have one of the best scorers in the country in Josh Hubbard, who averaged nearly 19 points per game. They'd face off against the 9-seeded Baylor Bears out of the Big 12, and this game was super close, but unfortunately they were not able to get a good shot off at the end and lost to the Bears by 3 and went home early. Honestly, for me, the most memorable thing about Ole Miss basketball over the last few decades was the rise of Marshall Henderson, and other than that, they haven't done a whole lot. They haven't had much of a basketball history, but they hired Chris Beard after he was fired from Texas. No one can debate he's a good basketball coach, and he ended up leading the Rebels to a 22-11 record and a tie for 6th place in the conference, which was good enough to get them a 6th seed in the tournament bracket. They had 6 players who averaged more than 10 points per game, meaning they're one of the deeper teams in the SEC. Ole Miss so far has gotten off to a hot start, as they beat the 11th-seeded play-in North Carolina Tar Heels, and then recently blew out number 3 seed Iowa State. Ole Miss will now face off against the Michigan State Spartans in the Sweet 16, and they could be a dark horse to make a deep run this year. Alright, so finally I guess we get to talk about my school, the Missouri Tigers, as they've spent a couple of years trying to find a good basketball coach. They were honestly brought into the SEC to help out with hoops, and after that loss to Norfolk State, they just kinda were never the same. They can't get out of the first round, and whiffed on both Konzo Martin and Kim Anderson at coach. Luckily, they found Dennis Gates, who led them to the tournament in their first season, but after not winning a game until November in 2024, he was on the hot seat. Luckily, though, the Tigers had a bounce-back season, as they went 22-11 and tied for 6th in the conference, and also got a 6th seed. They had some premier wins over schools like Kansas, Alabama, and Florida, and the last time the Tigers made the Sweet 16 was in 2009, and I thought they could make a run, but instead, they got put in probably the worst situation of any SEC school. They had to play against the Drake Bulldogs, who make life very difficult for their opponents, and Mizzou had their 2nd worst offensive showing of the season, and lost to the 11th-seeded Drake Bulldogs, and went home early. So yeah, those are the 14 teams that ended up making the tournament. What does the future look like in the conference? Honestly, I think the SEC is set up to be the best football and best basketball conference for the next few years, with coaches like Bruce Pearl, Rick Barnes, and Nate Oates not going anywhere, and other coaches like Chris Jans, Todd Golden, and Chris Beard are quickly rising up the ranks. Honestly, I don't think there's a bad coach in the Southeastern Conference, but I do think Matt McMahon's days at LSU are numbered. I do worry about schools like Georgia, Oklahoma, and Mizzou, as they could easily fall off and fall behind, but we'll honestly just have to wait and see what happens. But what do you guys think? Do you think the SEC was overrated this year? How do you think they've gotten so good at basketball? And what does the future look like for your SEC school? Be sure to let me know down below, leave a like if you want to support today's video, subscribe if you're new, and check out all of the videos on the end screen. Hope to see you guys again soon, but until next time, peace.